2023 has been the worst year for bankruptcy since the tail end of the global financial crisis in 2008. This year, some of the world's biggest and most highly regarded companies are failing to pay off massive debts. Meanwhile, the investors and CEOs behind these failures are laughing all the way to the bank. But how is this possible? If these people aren't responsible for their own risk and poor decisions, then who is? Well, WeWork, Vice, and Silicon Valley Bank are just a few major companies that have all filed for bankruptcy this year. WeWork, for example, went from being valued at over $47 billion to being a penny stock. The company was considered a venture capitalist dream, raising seemingly endless funds and taking on billions in debt from investors such as SoftBank, Insight Partners, BlackRock, and Goldman Sachs. Yet not once since its founding has WeWork ever actually turned a profit. So where was all this money going? Well, WeWork's former CEO Adam Neumann was known for his erratic management style and excessive spending. For example, on a whim, he decided to enact a policy that saw the bottom 20% of WeWork's employees fired in favor for more expensive new hires every year. In addition to that, he created an arm of the company dedicated to the development of self-driving mail carrier robots for WeWork offices, and he even sanctioned the purchase of a $63 million jet by the company for himself and other executives. And this was just the tip of the iceberg for Neumann's horrible management decisions. However, after a failed initial public offering in 2019, tech investor SoftBank acquired WeWork and actually paid Neumann $1 billion to resign from his role at the helm. And then soon after the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and a company that dealt in providing shared office space as a service was now left without a product to sell, still locked into high rent costs from years prior. In addition to that, interest rates on capital loans continued to soar, meaning WeWork would fail to sensibly acquire enough cash to repay its creditors. At face value, it would seem that the company is destined to evaporate completely. However, if you walk amongst the streets, you still see WeWork everywhere, with the company still being completely operational, because in November this year, WeWork played the ultimate trump card. Like so many private companies in 2023, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This means despite going bankrupt, WeWork is still fully operational. But how? You see, when we imagine a company going bankrupt, we usually imagine something closer to a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. This type of bankruptcy is both available to companies and individuals alike. Chapter 7 of the US Bankruptcy Code completely terminates the company's operations, taking the company completely out of business. The company is then forced to liquidate its assets until its creditors are fully paid. However, most companies going bankrupt will opt for a Chapter 11 bankruptcy instead, just like WeWork did. When a company like WeWork files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, it's often referred to as reorganization bankruptcy, as they're allowed to continue operating while their debt payments are rescheduled. This is done on the condition that the company provides a reorganization plan to ensure their creditors of future profits, and in turn their future ability to pay outstanding debt. If a plan is agreed, then the company will remain in business and commence their reorganization. This usually results in mass layoffs and in some cases a reshuffling at the top, and depending on the size of the company, this will often leave thousands of employees without jobs. And usually these layoffs begin happening years before bankruptcy is actually declared. For example, WeWork has laid off nearly 9,000 people since 2019. Vice's headcount shrank by over 2,000 throughout its recent difficult years, and in anticipation of upcoming debt payments, Spotify just announced they're laying off 1,500 people this year. So we know the looming threat of bankruptcy and reorganization hurts the regular everyday people in the bottom half of the corporate ladder, leaving them searching for jobs in a distressed market and collecting unemployment. But then what happens to the CEOs and executives who run a previously successful company into the ground? Well, they make millions. And to find evidence of this, we don't need to look too far back. In 2020, massive retail company JCPenney, with doom on the horizon, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. However, it was revealed that just months before this filing, the CEO received a $4.5 million bonus and 3 of her fellow C-suite executives received $1 million as well. And sadly, this is a pattern for companies on the brink of bankruptcy. Just look at a bankrupt car rental company Hertz, paying over $16 million in bonuses to its highest ranking executives, or Chuck E. Cheese, the arcade and pizza giant, who paid their CEO $1.3 million just before they basically went extinct. And companies like Vice and a bunch of other companies are all repeating this pattern. The list just goes on of companies doing this today. So while employees are enduring pay cuts and massive layoffs as a result of poor decision making at the top, the CEOs and top executives responsible for destroying the companies are actually becoming richer than they were before in most cases. But it gets far worse, because CEOs and executives aren't the only ones profiting from bankruptcy. If you take a look at the list of companies that went bankrupt this year, most of them are owned by a small handful of private equity firms. And in case you're not familiar with what they do, private equity firms buy companies in the hopes of flipping them for a profit. The idea is extremely simple. These firms manage large sums of wealth, usually gathered from a combination of hedge funds, pension funds, university endowments, or high net worth individuals, to invest it on their behalf in high potential companies. And if the firm can help these companies reach their potential, the firm can then sell the company for more than they bought it for and their investors profit. But for some strange reason, private equity firms are horrible at accomplishing this. In fact, companies owned by private equity are actually 10 times more likely to fail. So why is this? Surely if you inject a company with a pile of cash and put a think tank of skilled financiers in charge of making it as profitable profitable as possible, it would be more likely to succeed than fail. And why would these ultra-powerful institutional investors stand by while their money is being pissed away by frauds? Well, it's hard to wrap your head around until you realize that these failures aren't accidents, they're by design. Now, the industry's defenders will claim that this can be explained because private equity firms often buy teetering, underperforming companies, buying low in order to sell high. So of course a disproportionate number will fail. Of course, no private equity firm would want their company to go bankrupt, right? Well, I would be inclined to believe that if only weren't for the firms making an insane amount of money from these bankruptcies. So here's how it works. So after reading how these CEOs can monetize their own failure, and seeing how it's going to be even harder for Gen Z to own a home than millennials, I couldn't help but wonder why we're supposed to get excited about investing our time and money into the system. This is how it looks when empires fall. It's economic and cultural decline. I mean, the West hasn't created a great new thinker in decades, barely even make original films or TV. We don't even make new billionaires anymore. 2023 was actually the first year billionaires made more wealth from inheritance than their own businesses. Even the global elites are just churning out reboots. Our greatest cultural products like contemporary art are getting older and older, becoming more and more scarce, and by that token more valuable. That's why billionaires all over are fighting to get their hands on it. And that's why I'm thrilled you guys have been taking advantage of the opportunity our sponsor Masterworks is offering, as you're part of over 878,000 investors shielding their portfolios from corporate fallouts like this, and taking money that would have flowed into billionaire bank accounts. Tens of thousands of investors saw a total of over $45 million in returns from sales. It's never been so easy to add art to your portfolio. There's no wonder why over 879,000 people have signed up. But since you guys have been taking advantage, you can still skip the line and get started today by going to masterworks.art/moon. A private equity firm will buy up a company primarily using debt instead of upfront cash. Once they finalize the deal and have full control over the company, they can then leverage that control to force their newly acquired company to take out loans from various lenders and banks, thus loading the company with debt. The company will then usually take out these loans under the guise of it being part of some long-term plan to improve the company. This way, the creditors will have reason to believe they will get their money back, and the company will repeat this process under direction from the private equity firm until the company no longer has the ability to take on more debt. Now that the company has spending power, the private equity firm will then instruct the company to acquire, invest, or hire the services of other companies in their efforts to improve. However, these other companies will also be owned by the same private equity firm. So this company will now be taking money out of the bank's pocket under their name and putting it into the pockets of the private equity firm via the firm's other entities. And finally, when the original company inevitably defaults on all of its debt and declares bankruptcy, the banks and lenders will only be able to collect on assets under the name of that specific company, and won't be able to touch anything else owned by the private equity firm as a whole. So in a case like this, it means a private equity firm has essentially used their collection of companies to hedge their bet. And even if the company they bought fails miserably now, which it more than likely will due to the massive burden of debt looming overhead, the private equity investors still make plenty of money. And if the company somehow succeeds and finds a way to profit themselves, in spite of the strategy, then even better. In that case, the private equity investors stand to make even more money. Now, what I just laid out for you is hypothetical, but there are countless examples of this sort of phenomenon happening right now, and these real life scenarios are even more sinister. If you live on the east coast of the US, you may remember Friendly's. For those unfamiliar, Friendly's was once a massive restaurant chain. At its peak, there were 850 brick and mortar locations. Now it's been reduced to just over 100. Friendly's was acquired by private equity firm Sun Capital back in 2007. The firm piled debt onto the business and even required the chain to sell and lease properties for a number of its locations. Ultimately, this strategy pushed Friendly's into bankruptcy, and as you might have guessed, Sun Capital made a fortune in the process. So how did they do it? Well, Sun Capital's lawyers successfully petitioned the court to expedite the bankruptcy process through what's called a 363 sale. This is when a company's assets or the company itself are auctioned off free of its prior debts. By allowing an open auction to take place, the court's influence is largely removed, and in Friendly's case, this gave Sun Capital greater leeway to choose a buyer. So who did they choose? Well, Sun Capital decided to sell the company to themselves. By adopting a credit bidding strategy, Sun Capital was able to indirectly kill all external interests in the auction without having to put up any real cash. Instead, Sun Capital, through another one of its subsidiaries, offered to become Friendly's lender and forgive its hundreds of millions in unpaid debts, an offer no one in their right mind would match. But what was the end goal here? Why would Sun Capital force a restaurant chain into bankruptcy just to sell it to another one of its subsidiaries? Well, for pensions. You see, when they filed for bankruptcy, Friendly's had $115 million in pension liabilities liabilities, and by selling Friendly's to one of its affiliates, Sun Capital reacquired its own company free and clear of those liabilities, because in the event of a sale, these debts get pushed into the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, otherwise known as the PBGC, which is a government-chartered insurer that rescues underfunded pensions. So with this move, Sun Capital essentially let themselves off the hook for pensions they owed to Friendly's employees and shifted the obligation onto the US government. This then left 6,000 employees and retirees in financial limbo. And perhaps the worst part is that Sun Capital has no remorse for what they did. When questioned by the New York Times about their manipulation of bankruptcy law, Sun Capital's co-founder smugly responded, "We don't make the rules." And Sun Capital went on to do the same thing to several other companies, leaving ordinary pensioners and taxpayers to foot the bill for their excess. But unfortunately, Sun Capital is just one of thousands of private equity machines using debt and bankruptcy manipulation to shift their costs onto workers. According to a 2015 Harvard study, private equity firms had pushed more than 50 companies into bankruptcy and transferred to the PBGC more than $1.5 billion in obligations in just over a decade. In the process, people lost $128 million from their pensions. And more often than not, these firms are far more blatant in their shady dealings than Sun Capital. In many cases, private equity is just writing a check to their investors and shareholders straight from the coffers of their companies in the form of dividends. Private equity firms, when purchasing a new company, will jumpstart a process called dividend recapitalization, and this is essentially a more blatant form of what I mentioned before. The newly acquired company will raise money as quickly as possible by issuing new debt from lenders and use the proceeds to pay dividends directly to shareholders and private investors. This allows private equity to immediately recoup their investment and shift their risk onto the company. For example, Petco was taken private for the first time back in 2000 by a firm called Texas Pacific Group, who purchased the company for $600 million. Prior to this acquisition, Petco had $90 million in long-term debt, and just 2 years later, when Petco went public again, it was saddled with $400 million in long-term debt, and it was revealed later that a majority of these funds had actually been paid directly to private shareholders. And so the company then went private again in 2006 and is now owned by CVC Capital, who is surely employing the same strategy. And so as of 2021, it was estimated that Petco had nearly $1.7 billion in long-term debt in a 3.5% interest rate, and now in 2023, Forbes is predicting bankruptcy could be on the horizon. CVC Capital alone has done this to several other companies over the years. Another example from their portfolio is when they bought BJ's Wholesale Club, a US company that deals in grocery membership, and immediately demanded $643 million in dividends be paid to their investors. Of course, the company didn't have that amount available, and so they were forced to take out a huge loan. And the truth is that if you go down the list of companies that have gone bankrupt in recent years, you'll often find that just before their ultimate failure, they paid their private equity overlords hundreds of millions in funds they owed to lenders and banks. So this begs yet another question. Why did banks continue to lend money to companies that are likely to never pay them back? The banks financing the world's largest companies are to some degree too big to fail. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, between them over $9 trillion in assets. That's nearly 40% of America's total GDP. And not only are banks like this built to withstand a failed investments here and there due to their unfathomably diverse portfolio, but these banks are woven into the fabric of the US economy. If they were to disappear tomorrow, nearly 1/3 of American citizens' primary accounts would be in jeopardy and the world's biggest companies would collapse. So even if a long series of poor investment decisions and market circumstances ever caused one of them to be on the brink of failure, it would be in the US government's best interest to bail them out. Because of this, the biggest players have almost nothing to lose and everything to gain in the long term from lending depositors money to companies, owned by private equity or otherwise, at high interest rates. In fact, this is the primary way banks turn a profit. And in the event of a bankruptcy, they'll usually have already accounted for it and will make a majority of their money back through a combination of their initial payments with interest applied and the inevitable post-bankruptcy recourse. And in the event a company beats the odds and becomes wildly profitable, then they'll get a significant return on their investment to outweigh any percentage they might have lost on their less successful investments. And they know that if the greater market goes south and causes their calculated investment model to fail, then Uncle Sam will foot the bill to some degree. We saw a version of what this looks like on a mass scale back in 2008 during the Great Recession. And although we probably won't see a similar mass collapse and bailout again due to stricter regulations and learned lessons, there are still plenty of securities in place for the top institutions to be able to take massive hits and walk away unscathed. But what happens if a bank that doesn't quite make it to that category takes a massive unexpected hit in 2023? Well, on March 10th, we witnessed the answer to this question. It was the day that Silicon Valley Bank became the second largest bank failure in US history. At the time, Silicon Valley Bank had $209 billion in assets, and this would lead you to believe that it was big enough to avoid its eventual fate. But Silicon Valley Bank's biggest issue wasn't its size, it was its lack of diversity. Silicon Valley Bank invested a large portion of their bank deposits in long-term US Treasuries and agency mortgage-backed securities, the risk being that bonds and Treasury values fall when interest rates increase. So when the Federal Reserve hiked up interest rates in 2022 to combat inflation, SVB's bond portfolio started to drop.
They bought US federal government bonds, but they were long dated. So, these are 5-10-year bonds. And so as interest rate increases, the value of those bonds decrease.
You see, Silicon Valley Bank used to lend out money in short durations. However, in 2021, they shifted to the aforementioned long-term securities for more yield, and when they did this, they didn't protect their liabilities with enough short-term investments for quick liquidations, in case depositors ever needed to make withdrawals. And so they were insolvent for months because they could not liquidate their assets without taking a large loss. On top of that, SVB's banking clients were mostly large venture capital-backed tech startups. So when economic factors began affecting the tech sector negatively, disaster struck. Their customers began to withdraw money as venture capital started to dry up.
The stock in the bank started to decline. Depositors started to withdraw their money. They were also withdrawing their money because technology, that sector, was in a downturn, right? And so instead of putting money into the bank, depositors were taking money out of the bank.
And when SVB didn't have the cash on hand to liquidate these deposits, they started having to sell their bonds before maturity at a significant loss just to keep up. This caused customers and investors to panic and lose faith in the bank. And when people start to lose faith in a bank, that's always the beginning of the end. After SVB disclosed selling their assets at a loss, news spread like wildfire on social media. This fear that the bank would not have the capital to support future withdrawals and loans triggered what's referred to as a bank run, meaning people started to withdraw their money in waves, hoping not to be the ones left on the hook once SVB runs out of capital. Not to mention, as part of this chain reaction, SVB's stock plummeted by 60%, and within 48 hours after disclosing the sale of its assets, Silicon Valley Bank had fully collapsed and was shut down by California regulators. Subsequently, Silicon Valley Bank's parent company, SVB Financial Group, declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So in this case, who's left paying for Silicon Valley Bank's mistakes? Well, the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission will cover lost deposits and is estimated to cost them up to $20 billion. But the FDIC limits payouts for lost deposits at $250,000, and a majority of Silicon Valley Bank's customers, given they were venture capital-backed tech companies, had accounts with higher value, so they may be left on the hook for millions as well. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley Bank lives on to fight another day after being acquired by First Citizens Bank just 17 days after its collapse, a deal that makes them one of the 15 largest banks in the United States.
First Citizens Bank buying a large chunk of Silicon Valley Bank, around $72 billion of SVB's assets at a discount of $16.5 billion.
And so while private equity and massive banks play a risk-reward game, it's really everyone else, the federal government, the workforce, the retirees, public shareholders, who take on all the risk while they reap the reward along the way. And at the end of the day, a poorly run company will always have bankruptcy as a get-out-of-jail-free card they can play at any moment to wipe their hands of financial obligations and exploit for loopholes, costing people who play by the rules millions if not billions. It's a broken system, and with inflation continuing to rise, higher interest rates will likely follow, meaning more companies loaded with debt by private equity and banks with poorly diversified portfolios will likely continue to fail in 2024. Meanwhile, the executives and private investors behind these institutions will continue to ride the economy's misery into the sunset.